This is a prominent family, highly regarded. They live in an area that is with, financial resource.
From a picture-perfect life in southern Florida to a messy divorce years in the making.
Those who could love passionately could hate passionately. Divorces may come with a heightened level of emotion.
Now, this prominent Miami-Dade developer is accused of poisoning his estranged wife.
The symptoms of her illness started shortly after she requested the divorce.
And while charges have yet to be filed, there have been federal raids on both his home and real estate office, and experts have an idea what they're looking for.
Did Mr. Pino on any of his search engines look up fentanyl, look up fentanyl poisoning? Do we have any communique between him and other associates who may have potentially been involved in purchase? They're also going to want to take a look at his financial records.
To understand the case as of now, we have to head back to 1992 when Sergio and Tatiana Pino got married. The couple were together for decades and even share 2 daughters. They're based in the Miami, Florida area, where Sergio is the president of Century Home Builders Group, a position he's held for 32 years. But this lavish lifestyle saw some major changes back in 2022 when Tatiana filed for divorce. Around that same time, she started experiencing symptoms of fentanyl poisoning.
This is its own category of crime, or let's say a potential crime, because as we speak, it's an allegation, nobody's been arrested and charged. However, the crime itself is called familicide. So what that refers to is when a family member either harms and or kills another family member.
For this story, we reached out to Dr. Debbie Goodman, a Miami-based criminologist. She says the case is making waves in her community, even though Sergio has yet to be charged. But Goodman says his alleged crime would be labeled as familicide.
And certainly in that category, we would refer to cases that have preceded, right, to include Alex Murdaugh and the killing of his wife and son, Lori Vallow Daybell, who killed her 2 children, and even most recently, the case of the 2 moms out of Oklahoma, whereby we think, or it's alleged, that the mother-in-law orchestrated their killings due to a child custody case. So now we put the spotlight on the Pino case in South Florida.
According to Tatiana Pino's sworn deposition, she began experiencing breathing issues in 2022 after filing for divorce. She was intubated 6 times and was in and out of the hospital for 3 years. Ultimately, a doctor at Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore determined she was experiencing side effects from fentanyl poisoning. Now, right away, when I'm thinking somebody's going to the hospital, poison doesn't jump into my mind. How would doctors make that leap to even test for potential poisoning?
Right, good question. Well, once one is admitted, and of course the patient would talk about what the symptoms are, we could detect fentanyl in the blood test and or the urine test. And just to remind the viewers, fentanyl is considered a synthetic opioid, which is basically 100 times the potency of heroin. So believe it or not, one little pinch, one little dash would be enough to kill an adult. And yet, thankfully, Miss Pino, Tatiana Pino, is alive. The question is, though, is it a far reach or is it not that Mr. Sergio Pino would have been the one potentially to put the fentanyl in some type of food? But allegedly, according to Mrs. Pino, the symptoms of her illness started shortly after she requested the divorce. Now, again, curious, and it raises the question mark, but as we're saying, it's still merely an allegation. We can't necessarily yet say that it was Mr. Pino.
According to Tatiana, the Johns Hopkins doctor told her to stay with her sister rather than in her normal surroundings. So after she moved out of her home with Sergio, Tatiana apparently stopped experiencing symptoms. During her sworn deposition, Sergio's attorney asked Tatiana, "Do you believe that your husband poisoned you?" Her reply, quote, "I believe that he did." Right from the jump, my mind gets going with motive. I always want to know, why would something like this happen? And again, only allegations, there have been no charges yet. But to me, and the reporting I've seen, a lot of things that are mentioned include the divorce proceedings. So can we just jump right away to that potentially being a motive?
Oh, absolutely. You're right on point. And again, we can speak generally and then we could speak specifically. So, generally, divorces may come with a heightened level of emotion, right? Each side wants to win. Now, what's a win? It depends if children are involved, if financial resources are involved. And now, specifically in this case, we really are talking about a heightened level of the financial resources between them. Now, does one party not want to proffer monetary means to the other? That's quite likely. The other, and what tends to happen also, Sierra, with these high profile divorce cases that are almost teeter tottering on the harm to another and or conspiring to hurt somebody and or the potential of killing somebody. Some of these emotions, it's a theory I came up with, and it's called JAR, JAR, jealousy, anger, revenge. So sometimes those are elements too. Now, again, we don't know with levels of specificity yet, based on once more of the FBI's findings. But let's just say, hypothetically or potentially, what if one party was cheating on the other party? That could, of course, heighten these levels of the JAR motive, the jealousy, anger, revenge. But again, we shall wait and see.
And I know we've touched on this briefly, but this is really your area of expertise. So I wanted to dig in just a little bit more. We're talking about familicide, which you've mentioned several times, but what is the criminology behind this? I know we touched on divorce potentially being a part of it, or potentially infidelity if that's what happened in their relationship. But why would someone want to kill their spouse or family member?
Right. So let's just start then with basic psychology and then we'll introduce forensic psychology. So, basic psychology may tell us that those who could love passionately could hate passionately. And then when we introduce forensic psychology, which really has to do with the mindset of the criminal, the person who's doing wrongdoing, we know there are characteristics that are aligned in many of these cases, not just the Pino case, but again, back to Alex Murdoch and back to Lori Daybell and even potentially the Morphew case, right? Suzanne and Barry Morphew, although he has not been charged, an allegation is he potentially killed his wife. So what's at the heart of a lot of this, Sierra, is we start first with vigilante justice. Vigilante justice really in the mindset of a potential killer whereby one just completely dismisses the laws, the rules, policies, procedures, and they do their own thing. And what becomes intriguing about that in the field of criminology, we call it two things: mens rea, which really is the criminal intent. These people tend to be very intentional, very purposeful. There's no accident. But the part two to that is called actus reus. That itself is the criminal act. So when we have both, the mens rea, the criminal mindset, and the actus reus, the criminal act, that combined usually is pointing to a first degree murder. But other characteristics that I would mention in this conversation as well would be that of hedonism. So these killers who are hedonistic, that refers to pleasure seeking. They truly derive pleasure almost A to Z, planning the crime, carrying out, and then the aftermath of it, especially if they think they've gotten caught. So I think that really is the psychology behind somebody who is participating in familicide. Most of these people think that they can get away with it and that they're smarter than law enforcement.
Again, just to be clear, no charges against Sergio Pino have been filed, but we can confirm he's been the subject of multiple FBI raids.
And literally, Sierra, as you know, and as we speak, the FBI has already conducted two search warrants, one of which of the Pino home, and the second one of Mr. Pino's business. So clearly, they're looking for some type of evidentiary element, right? Whether it's going to be computer related data, communication with others potentially to conspire. So those findings are going to be really important.
The FBI confirmed raids were performed on Sergio's home and office as part of their investigation, but that's all they'll say. How would investigators go about connecting anyone to this alleged fentanyl poisoning? Because as of right now, we don't have any charges, but things are kind of pointing in the direction of the husband. How would investigators and later prosecutors make that jump?
Absolutely. So, hence, literally as we speak, what has just been concluded would be those searches of the family home. Now, what would that include? When we talk about the Fourth Amendment, we're talking about being within the constitutional framework of a search and a seizure. Now, all of the search warrants of the family residence, as well as Mr. Pino's business, would allow investigators, the FBI, of course, is the federal entity handling this. And so it would allow them to seize items such as what? Such as anything technologically related, computers, phones, data, journals, things that might potentially point to communication. That's going to be very key in this case, I believe. Meaning, did Mr. Pino on any of his search engines look up fentanyl poisoning? Do we have any communique between him and other associates who may have potentially been involved in purchase? They're also going to want to take a look at his financial records. Would specific people within the time frame of Mrs. Pino's illness have been paid, let's say, X number of dollars? And then what would that be for? So there's really a lot up in the air, but yet these would be the issues that I'd be looking at as a criminologist to potentially make that connection between him and what her allegations are.
Goodman says it's clear what the feds are looking for, and Sergio Pino's attorneys are probably already on top of it. And we've talked about what the FBI agents are likely looking for, namely its cell phone data or search engine results that are incriminating, whether he's Googling fentanyl poisoning, poisoning of any kind, things like that. But let's say they do find these things and he is charged, just speculating, looking down the line. How would his defense combat that? Because these allegations date back to 2022 when Miss Pino originally had these symptoms of fentanyl poisoning, and we may not have that data anymore or the health charts, etc. So how would his defense kind of say, hey, you know what, we have nothing to do with this?
Right. Well, certainly he's got his attorneys who are thinking along those lines even as we speak, and potentially they could negate it by saying that he's been this loving, doting husband, not only husband, but father. They have two daughters, and that they might want to almost do what's called, as we know in our field, point the fingers. So instead of pointing toward one with culpability, right, and reliability and responsibility, instead fingers get pointed elsewhere to where is it possible, just hypothetically again, that Mrs. Pino has somebody else who may want to harm her? Or was there any other type of family disharmony or discord? Because familicide sometimes does become far reaching, that it's not just a singular person in a family, but sometimes there's collusion and there's more than one person who may want to, for whatever reason unknown at the moment to us, want to do her harm. So I think that might be a potential strategy, pointing the fingers elsewhere at those who may have disharmony and discord with her.
But the fentanyl poisoning allegations aren't the only allegations Sergio Pino faces. Apparently, he's also being investigated for recruiting several others to do his bidding. Baron Bennett, Michael Dulfo, Edner Etienne, and Jaren Howard face a variety of charges, including a racketeering-related indictment for, quote, the intent to kill, injure, and intimidate. These men are accused of putting Tatiana and her sister, quote, in reasonable fear of death or serious bodily injury. All of this allegedly happened between June 2022 and March 2024, during which time the men apparently stalked Tatiana, orchestrated a hit and run with her vehicle, and even burned 3 of her sister's vehicles. Things get a little bit more complicated, though, because again, we have the husband, Sergio Pino, who has not been charged, But there are three people who face charges, and the allegations there are that he potentially hired some of his part time workers in potentially a murder for hire situation, a hit and run situation that there's apparently security camera video of. How does all of this play into the larger story?
Certainly, and then once again, great points. So, how does it play in? And also, what's interesting in the state of Florida, we would classify that potentially as conspiracy. Conspiracy to do bodily harm to another, conspiracy to potentially commit murder. Now, once again, if those dots are connected and if these associates were hired by Mr. Pino in the state of Florida, conspiracy is very much aligned with first degree murder with up to a life sentence.
You spoke about just then state charges, but we know that there are federal raids on the Pino home and then also the company. Why would it be investigated by the feds rather than local or state authorities?
Right. Well, there could be different jurisdictions for different crimes. So, because the residence is, let's say, in a local jurisdiction of the Coral Gables Pinecrest area, then yes, we have had investigations done by that law enforcement entity. And then, depending on are there any state charges, was any type of narcotic potentially involved in crossing state lines, then we would have state investigators. But now the fact that the FBI is involved and they're in charge of the totality of the investigation does suggest that federal crimes are pending for these three to four other associates. And if Mr. Pino is indeed the ringleader, if you will, or the coordinator of such, then he too gets charged with federal conspiracy charges.
If charges are filed, Goodman has an idea of what Sergio Pino could be up against. Let's say that charges are eventually filed down the line, again, speculation, but if that's what we're looking ahead to, and this does go to trial, is it possible that both the Pinos, maybe even their daughters, are called to testify and then their dirty laundry is aired out all over Miami and the world, so to speak?
Right, it certainly is possible. And then what would that look like? That would look like questions of the daughters regarding the nature of the relationship between their parents. What did they hear? What did they witness? What do they even think, right? Because even when we look back at that Lori Daybell case and who did what to whom, and sometimes we are hearing the questioning of other extended family members. I think that is a likely strategy. Now, it could work one of two ways. It could be helpful to the defense if these daughters were to say that there's no way that their father could potentially be involved in wrongdoing, and he's only been a loving father to them and a wonderful spouse to their mother. Or if and when we start to hear about arguments and language and statements made that are incriminating, that could hurt Mr. Pino.
Looking ahead, Goodman says we're in a holding pattern, but we could soon see movement. What do you expect to happen as this case moves forward? Will charges be filed? Anything found in those FBI raids?
Well, again, speculation, but because there's been such an extensive search of the home, of the business, the of such of Mr. Pino, I would be very curious, let's say, to know the findings of what you had mentioned earlier, and that would be these communication exchanges. With whom did he communicate? What did he search? If there really is something there, then of course law enforcement would have what's very necessary, and that's the probable cause to proceed with some type of charge, ultimately leading to arrest. But we're kind of in this holding pattern and period. We don't know yet, but in fairness, the searches were just conducted, and I think it would be forthcoming pretty soon to hear the revelations and the findings.
One thing's for sure, Goodman says the entire Miami community is abuzz following this case.
I just always feel, this sense of emotion when we're talking about a husband and wife, they have children, it's a family. there's prominence to this family. And if and when somebody wants to hurt another person who's part of your family, it just has this stinging effect. It kind of just leaves us with that sour taste of how and why would somebody do it.
Sergio Pino's attorneys say he is fully cooperating with the federal raids, but deny any criminal wrongdoing. As for his 4 associates who face racketeering-related charges, they've all pleaded not guilty and are headed to trial next month. Reporting for Law&Crime, I'm Sergio Gillespie.